one of the things that I don't think most of us realize, unless you read the history, that amortizing mortgages did not start until 1937. Prior to that, you took a mortgage out if you wanted to buy a home, and then every year you paid the interest on that. There was no principal reduction required. And so during the Depression, that's one of the reasons why housing prices declined so much, was that there had been no reduction in principal, and when the Federal Reserve shrunk the total amount of money by a third, there was no way the values could hold up. And so you had everybody practically underwater on mortgages. So in 1937, they started the amortizing mortgage, where every month you made a payment, and part of that went to reduce your principal. So that's, before that, we were literally 100 years or more as far as the value of mortgage. What's happened since the early 1980s, and certainly by the mid-1990s and all through the 2000s, the only way that a bank would issue a 30-year mortgage was if they had a place to go with that, to place it in some form of securitization. And so that was the general model that happened until late 2008, when the markets for those collapsed, and the only players were Freddie and Fannie. Well, after Fannie and Freddie went under, we now have another agency, the FHA, also got involved with that. But today, the only 30-year mortgages you're finding are what's called conforming. They meet the criteria for Freddie and Fannie. They can only be a certain size in certain markets, and they did adjust that in certain high-priced markets. So the conforming number is anywhere from 400,000 to about 700,000, depending on the market. Today, if that doesn't happen and you don't fall into that range, it's called non-conforming. And those are one-off transactions done by each bank. One of the things that was a dramatic change in the market prior to this, the jumbo mortgages were perceived to be the most safe. Those were the ones that were in the large homes, where they're above the conforming level, where you had people that were making a lot of money, and the mortgage may be $1 million or $1.2 million, and there was a private market for that. Those were perceived to be the safest. After the collapse in 2008, that market almost dried up for a while. And today, if you have a jumbo loan, the rate is typically, 1% to 2% above what a conforming mortgage rate would be. Again, there's a discrimination against upper-end houses, and so that's an issue that has changed. But today, for a conventional bank, we've got to have a place to go with a 30-year mortgage, or we're not going to make it.
Right. Exactly.
Questions? Wait for the mic, please.
With the recent problems with foreclosures, what do you think the risk is of the originating banks having to make the bondholders whole, since during the securitization process, essentially defective securities were sold?
Well, it's very interesting. The New York Supreme Court today threw out a lawsuit that was led by a good friend of mine, David Grace, who's been suing on behalf of the bondholders of some of the countrywide pass-throughs. And they objected to the settlement that Bank of America did on behalf of Countrywide with the, I think it was 13 different states on similar issues. The trouble is that the investors, unless they can get 25% of the bondholders of a given issue, don't have standing. The only party who has standing to sue, and this would be a securities fraud claim, for example, is the trustee for the Delaware trust that issued the bonds. Who hired the trustee? The underwriter. So there's a conflict here, but the courts have not yet closed and dealt with that issue. I suspect it's going to be appealed to the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York, by the way. We've switched it around. The Supreme Court is in the middle of New York. But it's a very, very difficult issue because there is a conflict. You're absolutely right. The trustee is not independent. Oftentimes it's a nominee. There really isn't a trustee. And I'll tell you something else. JP Morgan today pulled out of what's called MERS. MERS is the RoboCop signer that was attesting to the title on all of these faulty foreclosures. They was just sign it and say, oh yeah, I know that this is in fact correct and that this is the lien holder. Well, the reason is Morgan did it right. The people who did the documentation on their deals actually insisted on certain provisions in the wording. Many of the other deals had a blank for the name of the trustee, and the contract said, this must be conveyed and assigned to the trustee specifically in order for this contract to be final and live. They didn't do that. They just threw the documents in a folder and went on to do the next deal. This is Wall Street being sloppy, but you're right. There's a defect issue here, and we're going to be fighting this for years. The lawyers are going to be embroiled in this for years.
And I believe that for years, the word securitization will be the dirty word that options were in the 1930s, but it will come back because I think securitization at its core is a good idea because it allows for the accumulation of small amounts of capital to fund housing or to fund anything else. And as a result, I think through the sort of the lessons learned, and I don't think we've learned them all yet, and this is another one about having tightly written documentation, but the regulators will figure out what forms we need to put in front of people to have them sign such that when they don't pay their mortgage, the loss of it goes in the various directions and we know how to dispose of the property. Right now, because of sloppiness, essentially because we thought we knew more than we did, where we've left ourselves open for these kinds of long protracted problems, but we'll never find the bottom of the housing market until these things are solved.
There's one other issue from those type of securitizations is that back in 2008 in the fall when Lehman Brothers fell, you had mortgage-backed securities, which from an accounting standpoint under FASB rules will be considered a level 1 security because there was an active market. You can buy and sell and trade those daily, and there was a listed market. Bloomberg provided the information on most all the securities. Once Lehman failed and the whole market started tanking, those securities became level 3 securities. There was no active market. There was no inactive market. And one of the things that's happened certainly is the misstatement of financial statements since that point in time because the accountants couldn't catch up with what was happening in the real world. And so we have a problem now where you don't know what the value is. Your ability to get a bid on a security that is made up of these mortgages is virtually impossible. Again, you had Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers trying to sell all these securities back then, and so it became a forced liquidation value rather than a mark-to-market was what the accounting was, which is certainly contrary to a going concern concept. And so you have some major accounting issues that are still being resolved and not taken care of. The other thing that I would point out from the standpoint of the securitization and selling, I've had a place in Florida since 1995. In 2004, there was 3 major hurricanes that hit the state of Florida. And one of the problems with securitization and selling mortgages became when people went to collect from their insurance company on damages to their property, the insurance company had the property owner's name and also the name of who the mortgage holder was. And they would send a check to the property owner with both names on it.
Just like they do when you're in a car accident.
Yeah. Yep, that's right.
And so as Chris described, his original mortgager was Bank of New York.
Still is.
So that would be who would be on the check.
Yep.
And then the property owner would have to go through and try to find out who the ultimate owner of the mortgage was because they could not cash the check without the endorsement of the mortgagee. Yeah. And so you had property owners sitting on $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 insurance settlements that they couldn't cash the checks. And that, many of them were two years before they could track down who literally was able to endorse the check so they could get the money to start repairing their property.